He let an entire household believe he was nobody, and for 3 weeks nobody noticed him at all. Not the father calculating his usefulness over supper. Not the elder daughter rearranging the room around his attention. Only one woman in that house never once tried to perform for him, because she didn't know anyone worth performing for was listening. What she said to her sister, in a corridor she believed was empty, was never meant to reach his ears. But it did. And it would decide, before the month was through, exactly who deserved to be seen, and who never had been at all. The carriage that rolled through the gates of Brassington Hall carried no crest, no liveried outrider, no banner to announce its passenger. The wheels were caked with the dust of 3 days' travel, and the horses, though well-bred, wore no decoration beyond plain leather harness. It arrived the way any modest traveler's carriage might arrive, unremarkable, easy to overlook, the kind of conveyance that drew no eyes from the upper windows of a great house. And that was precisely the impression its occupant intended to leave, down to the last detail he had arranged before setting out. He stepped down without ceremony, his boots settling into the gravel with the unhurried ease of a man accustomed to commanding far grander entrances and choosing, deliberately, not to. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Hallam, a guest of distant acquaintance to Lord Brassington, traveling through the county before the season properly turned. No one questioned it, and no one had reason to. A man without a title was, in the practiced eyes of most drawing rooms, a man without consequence, easily placed at the far end of the table, easily forgotten in the arrangement of seating, easily underestimated by every servant who judged a guest's importance by the cut of his coat rather than the weight of his name. But Hallam had not come to be remembered. He had come to watch, and watching required a kind of disappearance that no title could ever permit him. 3 months earlier, a letter had reached him at his estate, vague in its wording, unsigned, hinting only that a household he once trusted held secrets unworthy of the name it carried, secrets that touched a family bound to his own by old obligation. He intended to learn the truth of it the only way truth could ever be reliably gathered, not by announcement, not by interrogation, but by becoming so unremarkable that no one in the house thought to perform for him at all. Brassington Hall received him with the particular curiosity reserved for strangers of indeterminate rank, not quite dismissed, not quite courted, suspended in the uncertain middle, where servants did not know whether to hurry or merely attend. The housekeeper noted his plain coat, his single modest trunk, the absence of a valet, and assigned him a respectable but unremarkable room on the second floor, one reserved for cousins of no particular consequence. The footman treated him with polite efficiency, the kind extended to a guest who might tip adequately, but was unlikely to matter beyond the week of his stay. At supper, the candlelight catching the silver and the good china brought out for any visitor, however unplaced, Lord Brassington welcomed him with the broad warmth of a man eager to please anyone who might prove useful, while privately calculating, behind a smile that never quite reached his eyes, what use a man called simply Mr. Hallam could possibly be to a household with daughters to marry off. Conversation drifted easily toward county matters, the state of the harvest, the upcoming assembly in town, and Hallam answered each question with careful vagueness, offering just enough warmth to satisfy curiosity without ever feeding it further than he intended. He observed instead, and the observing was its own quiet labor. He noted how the housemaids flinched almost imperceptibly when Lord Brassington raised his voice over a delayed dish, a small flinch born of habit rather than surprise. He noted how the elder daughter commanded the room the instant she entered it, drawing every candle's glow toward her as if by some natural law, and how the younger one entered almost apologetically, shoulders drawn slightly inward, as though she had long ago been taught that her presence required justification before it could be permitted to remain. Already, before the soup had even been cleared from the table, Hallam understood more about the architecture of this household than its own members suspected any stranger could. If you find yourself wondering what this house is truly hiding behind its candlelight and good manners, make sure you're subscribed, because the truth arrives slowly in this story, and you won't want to miss the moment it finally surfaces. Verity Quennell did not walk into a room so much as arrange it around herself, the way a painter arranges light before the first brushstroke falls. She had golden hair styled with a precision that wore the costume of carelessness, a laugh calibrated to draw attention without ever seeming to seek it, and an instinct for flattery so thoroughly practiced that it rarely registered as flattery at all. It simply felt, to its recipient, like being suddenly and pleasantly understood. Within minutes of Hallam's arrival, she had positioned herself beside him at the pianoforte, her fingers resting near the keys she had no real intention of playing, complimenting his unremarkable waistcoat as though it concealed the height of understated elegance. She asked about his travels, his connections, his opinions on the season's fashionable topics, each question a small netcast delicately to determine his worth before she committed further attention to him. When his answers gave her little material to work with, vague references to estates unnamed, business left deliberately undefined, she simply invented possibilities aloud for the benefit of anyone listening, suggesting perhaps he was a younger son of some discreet fortune, or a merchant's heir traveling to refine his manners before an inheritance came due. Hallam let her speculate freely, answering each guess with a non-committal courtesy that neither confirmed nor denied, watching her construct an entire biography for him out of nothing but ambition and hope. He found her tiring in the particular way that performance is tiring to watch from too close. Not unpleasant exactly, simply exhausting in its relentless calculation, the way every gesture seemed measured for an audience that never stopped watching, even when the room held only family. He wondered, not unkindly, what she might be like if no one were observing her at all, if there were no eligible stranger to charm and no rival to outshine. He suspected with something close to pity that she did not know the answer herself, and perhaps had not known it for years. It was several minutes before anyone thought to introduce the younger daughter at all, and even then the introduction arrived almost as an afterthought, the way one might mention a detail forgotten, and then hastily supplied. She had been standing near the window the entire time, occupied with rewinding a skein of gray wool that had slipped loose from its basket, her attention bent toward the small task with a focus that excluded the noise of the room around her. When Lord Brassington finally gestured toward her, it was with the absent tone of a man completing an inventory rather than presenting a daughter to a guest. "And this is Marisol," he said, the words landing without weight, without the warmth he had extended so freely to her sister moments before. Marisol curtsied with quiet correctness. The motion, economical and practiced, offered Hallam a brief, steady look that lasted perhaps 2 seconds longer than politeness required, and returned almost immediately to her wool, as though re-entering the room's attention had been a brief and slightly uncomfortable errand she was relieved to conclude. Hallam noted the omission that others in the room seemed not to notice at all. That she had been the last named, the least described, the daughter allowed to recede the moment formal introductions concluded, as if her presence were a footnote to a sentence already written about someone else. No one in the room appeared to find this strange, which struck him as stranger still. It appeared, in fact, to be the household's settled arrangement, worn smooth by long repetition. Verity occupied the foreground by unspoken agreement, and Marisol existed somewhere just behind it, useful, present, and almost entirely unconsidered. like furniture too familiar to be seen. Later that evening, as the family and their guest settled into the drawing room near the fire, the flames casting long shadows that softened the room's formality, a maid stumbled slightly while setting down the tea tray, her foot catching on the edge of the rug. One cup tilted dangerously toward the brink, the porcelain trembling against its saucer for a long, suspended second. Verity, mid-sentence in some story about a London acquaintance's scandalous bonnet, did not pause her telling. Lord Brassington did not look up from the newspaper folded across his knee. Marisol moved without announcement, without even the small intake of breath that usually precedes a sudden gesture, steadying the cup with 2 fingers before it could fall. The motion so quiet it barely disturbed the air around it. She then quietly refolded the corner of the tablecloth that had bunched beneath the tray's foot, the very thing that had caused the maid's stumble, a small adjustment that ensured the same mishap could not repeat itself moments later. She returned to her seat as though nothing at all had occurred, picking up her needlework precisely where she had left it, her expression unchanged, seeking no credit and apparently expecting none. Hallam, seated at an angle that gave him a clear and unobstructed view of the entire small sequence, said nothing aloud. But something in him recalibrated quietly, the way a compass needle settles after a long spin. It was a small thing, a steadied cup, a smoothed cloth, a problem solved before it could become one. Yet it told him more about character in 4 seconds than an hour of Verity's curated conversation had managed to reveal in an entire evening. He began, almost without deciding to, watching the quiet daughter instead of the loud one. But the evening still held a second observation he had not expected to make, one that would not announce itself until the candles had burned considerably lower and the house had settled into the particular silence that invites unguarded words. The fire had burned low by the time conversation turned, as it inevitably did in households with daughters of marrying age, toward speculation about the stranger seated among them. Lord Brassington asked, with the studied casualness of a man who had been waiting all evening for an opening, whether Mr. Hallam came from a family of trade or land. Hallam considered the question for a moment longer than it required, watching the firelight catch the rim of his untouched glass, and answered only that his family held property in the north. True in every word, and revealing nothing at all. He could have corrected the assumption forming around him with a single sentence. He could have ended the entire charade before it deepened, could have spared this household the eventual reckoning that silence guaranteed. But he had learned, across years of being received as a duke rather than as a man, that titles arrived in a room before their bearer did, rearranging every gesture and every word in anticipation of rank. He wanted, just once, to know what a household truly was when it believed no one of consequence was watching it. So he let the mistake stand, turning his glass slowly in his hand, offering Lord Brassington a smile that gave away nothing while privately cataloguing the ease with which a family revealed its true character to a man it believed unworthy of performance. It was not deception in the way deception is usually understood, he told himself. It was simply the absence of correction, a silence he had chosen to wear like a second coat, however uncomfortable it occasionally felt against the conscience. It was the coachman who first noticed the discrepancy, 3 days into Hallam's stay, when he recognized the particular bearing of a groom waiting near the stable yard. A groom dressed plainly but trained, unmistakably, in the manner reserved for ducal households. He said nothing to the family directly, only murmured his suspicion to the head groom over the mending of a bridle, and the head groom, in turn, mentioned it to the housekeeper while polishing silver that did not strictly need polishing. By the following afternoon, the whisper had traveled the particular underground channels by which servants' knowledge always outpaces the awareness of those they serve, reaching the kitchen, the laundry room, and eventually the ears of a lady's maid who happened to be lacing Verity's stays before the evening's entertainment. The maid, unable to contain news of such evident importance, relayed it in fragments. Something about the coachman, something about a duke, something that did not quite make sense but glittered with enough promise to be worth repeating. Verity received the fragment with the particular hunger of a woman who had spent the entire visit calculating a stranger's worth and finding the sum perpetually uncertain. If the whisper held even a grain of truth, then every flattery she had offered, every laugh she had calibrated, had been aimed not at some forgettable Mr. Hallam, but at a man whose name could elevate a family for generations. She said nothing of it to her father. Not yet, preferring to hold the possibility close until she could confirm it for herself, the way one holds a winning hand before revealing it at the table. Verity's pursuit, already considerable, sharpened into something closer to architecture. She altered her morning routine to ensure she crossed paths with Hallam near the garden where he habitually walked, arriving with a basket of cut flowers she had no genuine interest in arranging, offering instead a conversation thick with practiced charm and careful inquiries disguised as idle chatter. She brought up his unnamed estate again, phrased differently this time, hoping a fresh angle might extract what directness had not. She enlisted her father's help without quite asking for it outright, mentioning at breakfast how pleasant it would be to host a small evening of music, an evening that would naturally require Mr. Hallam's presence at her side near the pianoforte, where her playing, genuinely accomplished, whatever else might be said of her motives, could be displayed to its fullest advantage. Lord Brassington agreed readily, eager himself for any arrangement that might secure a connection whose true value he, too, had begun quietly investigating through correspondence with an old acquaintance in town. Throughout all of it, Marisol moved at the edges of the planning, asked to arrange the flowers Verity had gathered, but had no patience to place herself, asked to ensure the candles were trimmed and the chairs properly positioned for an evening designed entirely around someone else's ambition. She performed these tasks without complaint, the way she performed most tasks in that household, and if she noticed the particular fever building around their guests' possible importance, she gave no outward sign of caring one way or the other. The evening of music concluded later than expected, the guests dispersing to their rooms well past midnight, and Marisol found herself walking the long upstairs corridor toward Verity's chamber, summoned to help unpin her sister's elaborate hair before the maid could be located. The candles along the corridor had burned to stubs, casting pools of dim gold light interrupted by long stretches of near darkness, and the house had settled into the particular hush that follows an evening of forced gaiety. Inside Verity's room, the door left slightly ajar against the night's lingering warmth. The conversation between the sisters turned, as it often did once an audience had gone, toward blunt and unguarded territory. Verity, still flushed with the evening's small triumphs, mused aloud about what it would mean if the whisper proved true, if Mr. Hallam were indeed concealing a title worth the speculation, the kind of match that could secure not just her own future, but elevate the entire family's standing for a generation. Marisol, working the pins loose from her sister's hair with practiced patience, said little at first, accustomed to listening rather than contributing to conversations that rarely sought her opinion. But something in Verity's calculating tone, the casual way she discussed a man as though he were an asset to be acquired rather than a person to be known, pulled a response from Marisol that she had not entirely planned to give. A response neither of them realized was about to travel beyond the room's thin walls. "I don't care whether he's a duke or a drover," Marisol said quietly, setting the last pin down on the dressing table with deliberate care, her voice carrying none of her sister's performance, only a tired honesty that had been waiting, perhaps for years, for a moment private enough to surface. I care whether he's kind when no one's watching him be kind. That's the only title that's ever told me the truth about a person." Verity laughed, not unkindly, but dismissively, the laugh of someone who found the sentiment quaint and entirely impractical, the kind of thing one said before learning how the world actually rewarded ambition over gentleness. She turned the conversation back toward strategy, toward the music room and the angle of candlelight, and whether her gown's color had favored her properly, already moving past her sister's words as though they had been background noise rather than the most honest thing spoken in that house in weeks. But beyond the door, in the corridor he had not intended to linger in, Hallam had stopped walking the moment the first sentence reached him, his hand resting against the cool plaster of the wall, and he did not move again until long after the sisters' voices had drifted into other, lesser subjects. He had come to this house searching for the truth about a family's character, prepared to find disappointment in every corner he examined. He had not prepared himself for the possibility that the truth he most needed to hear would arrive, unguarded and unintended, from the one daughter who had never once tried to make him hear anything at all. She believed the door was closed. She believed the corridor was empty. She was wrong about both, and the man standing just beyond that thin wall was about to carry her words further than she ever could have imagined. Hallam returned to his room that night without remembering the particular sequence of steps that carried him there, the corridor's shadows blurring into one another as his mind turned over the sentence he had not meant to hear. He set down his candle with unusual care, as though the room itself might shatter if handled too roughly, and sat for a long while in the chair by the window, looking out at a garden he could not properly see in the darkness. Turning the words over the way one turns a coin to see if it holds the same weight from every angle. He had spent 3 months in this house disguise constructed to test a family's honesty, fully prepared to find the worst confirmed. Flattery built on speculation, kindness offered only where profit seemed possible, the slow erosion of decency that wealth and rank so often invited in households eager to climb higher. He had found exactly that in Verity, exactly what he expected, and it had cost him nothing to confirm it. But he had not built any test capable of accounting for a daughter who spoke with such unguarded honesty when she believed entirely that no one of consequence could hear her. The difficulty now was not what he had learned, but what to do with having learned it. He could not unhear the sentence, could not return to treating Marisol as a quiet fixture of the household's furniture, now that he understood the deliberate clarity of her character. And yet revealing that he had overheard her would taint the very honesty he had come to value, would turn a private truth into a performance, after all, the one thing he had hoped, in this entire household, to find spoken without an audience in mind. He decided, before the candle burned much lower, that whatever he did next would have to be done carefully, and slowly, and without ever announcing that he had been listening at all. Marisol woke the next morning with no memory of having said anything remarkable the night before, the conversation already fading into the unremarkable category where most exchanges with her sister eventually settled. She dressed, attended to the morning's small duties, and made her way down to the breakfast room with the same quiet steadiness that governed most of her days, expecting nothing different from the hours ahead. It was only when she crossed the upstairs corridor again, daylight now revealing details the candlelight had obscured the previous night, that a small unease settled into her stomach. The realization that the door to Verity's room had not, in fact, been fully closed during their conversation, and that the corridor beyond it led directly past the guest chamber where Mr. Hallam had been assigned. She paused at the spot, studying the gap beneath his door, trying to recall whether she had heard footsteps, whether the floorboard near his threshold had creaked the way it usually did when weight passed over it. She told herself the worry was likely unfounded, that guests retired early and slept soundly after an evening of music and wine, that her sister's chatter had probably masked anything worth overhearing, even if someone had been near. But the doubt did not fully dissolve, lingering at the edge of her thoughts through breakfast, through the small tasks of the morning, surfacing each time Mr. Hallam's quiet, watchful presence crossed her path. A presence that seemed, though she could not say precisely why, very slightly different than it had been the day before. A truth this quiet doesn't stay buried for long. Subscribe now, so you're here when the whole house finally learns what one daughter said without ever meaning to be heard. The whisper that had begun in the stable yard had, by the following week, grown too persistent to remain merely a servant's rumor. A neighboring family, the Renholts, arrived for an afternoon call and mentioned, with the particular delight reserved for delivering unconfirmed but delicious news, that they had heard, through the same web of servants' gossip that seemed to travel faster than any letter, that a duke was said to be traveling incognito somewhere in the county, evaluating households for reasons no one could quite specify. Lord Brassington's reaction, a too quick laugh, a too careful change of subject, did little to discourage the speculation gathering weight in his own drawing-room. Verity seized the opening immediately, steering the conversation toward Mr. Hallam's unnamed estate, his vague answers regarding his family, the groom recognized by the coachman, weaving the fragments into something that sounded, by the end of the visit, almost like confirmed fact, rather than the patchwork of rumor it actually remained. The Renholts left considerably more entertained than they had arrived, promising to spread the speculation further across the county before nightfall. Hallam, present for the entire exchange, maintained his careful neutrality throughout, offering neither confirmation nor denial, allowing the household's curiosity to climb without intervention. But he recognized, with the clear-eyed practicality of a man who had managed estates and tenants for over a decade, that the charade could not continue indefinitely. The questions multiplying around him were no longer idle. They were beginning to shape decisions, alliances, and ambitions throughout the household. And a truth left too long unspoken had a way of causing more damage than the truth itself ever would. Rather than confronting the speculation directly, Hallam chose instead to test what he had overheard, approaching Marisol with the same deliberate patience he might apply to a skittish horse. No sudden movement, no pressure that might cause her to retreat further into the background she so clearly preferred. He began appearing, with apparent casualness, in the garden during the early hours when she walked alone before the household woke, offering conversation that asked nothing of her except honesty. He asked her opinion on matters no one else in the household had thought to ask, what she thought of the tenant cottages they had passed on his arrival, whether she believed the new assembly rooms in town were worth their expense, what she made of a particular passage in a book he had noticed resting, well worn, on the windowsill of the drawing-room. Her answers came slowly at first, unaccustomed to being asked rather than instructed, but they came with the same unguarded clarity he had heard through the door that night, untouched by performance or calculation. She, in turn, began to notice him differently as well, though she could not have named precisely when the shift occurred. He listened in a manner she had rarely experienced from anyone in her own family, allowing silences to remain unfilled rather than rushing to occupy them, asking a second question when her first answer revealed more curiosity than her words alone had managed to convey. She did not yet understand the deeper currents moving beneath these quiet morning conversations, only that she found herself, against every habit of self-effacement she had cultivated for years, looking forward to them. Verity noticed the change before anyone else did, the small but unmistakable redirection of Mr. Hallam's attention from herself toward a sister she had long considered too plain and too quiet to constitute any genuine rivalry. The realization arrived not as panic, but as cold, calculated irritation, the particular fury of a woman who had spent considerable effort securing a prize only to watch it drift, inexplicably, toward someone she had never thought to guard against. She moved quickly to correct the imbalance, proposing an outing to the county assembly the following evening, framed as a generous gesture toward her sister's rarely indulged social life, but constructed with a precision that revealed its true purpose to anyone watching closely enough. Marisol would be seated, by careful arrangement, beside a visiting gentleman known throughout the county for his clumsy manners and louder opinions, ensuring that any comparison drawn that evening would fall entirely in Verity's favor, framing her sister as awkward and unsuited to refined company, precisely when refined company mattered most. Lord Brassington, oblivious to his elder daughter's calculations, approved the outing readily, pleased simply that his daughters were engaging socially during a week so heavy with speculation about their guests' possible importance. Marisol accepted the invitation with her usual quiet compliance, unaware that the evening had been engineered specifically to diminish her, unaware that the same household which had overlooked her for years was now actively working to ensure she remained overlooked a little longer. Just long enough, Verity hoped, for the question of Mr. Hallam's true identity to resolve itself in her own favor instead. The assembly room glowed with more candles than the modest gathering strictly required, the musicians tuning their instruments near a floor already filling with couples eager for the evening's first dance. Marisol arrived in a gown several seasons out of fashion, altered carefully by her own hand to disguise its age, standing in sharp and deliberate contrast to Verity's newly commissioned silk, a contrast Verity had ensured would be noticed by positioning them together at the room's entrance for exactly as long as it took the assembled company to draw comparisons. The gentleman seated beside Marisol for supper, a Mr. Edgecombe, visiting from a neighboring county, proved every bit as graceless as Verity had calculated, speaking loudly of his hunting exploits and laughing at his own jokes before anyone else had the opportunity to respond, while glancing periodically toward Marisol with the puzzled expression of a man uncertain why he had been seated beside someone so quiet. She seemed almost determined to disappear from the conversation entirely. Several nearby guests exchanged the particular glances reserved for witnessing a poor match, glances that landed, as intended, more heavily on Marisol than on her unfortunate companion. She bore it the way she bore most discomforts in that household, with a composed stillness that gave away nothing of what it cost her, though something in her posture had grown slightly more rigid by the time the second course arrived, slightly more careful, as though she were holding herself together through sheer determination rather than ease. She did not look toward Hallam, seated at a distance with Lord Brassington, though she was aware, with the particular awareness one develops toward a person who has begun to matter, of exactly where in the room he was standing. She thought the worst of the evening was already behind her. She had no idea that the man watching from across the room had seen everything, and was about to do something no one in that assembly would forget. Hallam watched the engineered humiliation unfold with mounting and carefully concealed displeasure, recognizing Verity's hand in the seating arrangement within moments of observing it, recognizing, too, the particular cruelty of cloaking such deliberate cruelty in the language of generosity. He did not announce himself, did not reveal the title that would have instantly silenced every snickering glance in the room, because he understood that such a revelation would solve nothing about the family's character. It would simply terrify them into temporary politeness rather than genuine decency. Instead, he crossed the room with unhurried purpose and requested, with perfect and unremarkable courtesy, the next dance with Miss Marisol Quennell, phrasing the request loudly enough that the surrounding guests could not mistake its sincerity for pity. The room's attention shifted instantly, the same eyes that had watched her discomfort now recalculating their assessment of a woman apparently worth a gentleman's deliberate attention, even a gentleman whose rank remained, officially, still uncertain, Marisol accepted with a composure that did not fully disguise her surprise, and as they moved into the formation of the dance, Hallam offered no explanation for his timing, no acknowledgement that he had witnessed the evening's quiet cruelty. He simply danced with the careful attentiveness of a man giving his full and undivided focus to his partner, allowing his presence beside her to speak whatever correction the room required without needing to name the injustice it was correcting. It was Mr. Edgecombe himself, flushed with wine and eager to recover some social standing after his own clumsy supper performance, who finally voiced what half the assembly had been whispering for a fortnight, declaring loudly to anyone within hearing that his own coachman had recognized the Duke's groom from a hunting party the previous autumn, and that the gentleman now dancing with Miss Marisol was no Mr. Hallam at all, but the Duke of Strathyre, traveling under a borrowed name for reasons no one in the room could explain, but everyone found instantly fascinating. The music did not stop, but conversation around its edges certainly did, heads turning in rapid succession toward the dance floor where Hallam, recognizing that the moment of choice had finally and irrevocably arrived, met the room's collective stare without flinching and without denial. He inclined his head slightly, the smallest possible acknowledgement, and confirmed in a voice calm enough to silence further speculation that the gentleman's information was, in fact, entirely correct. The revelation moved through the assembly like a change in weather, transforming the room's casual curiosity into something closer to reverence, voices dropping, postures straightening. The particular electricity that accompanies the unmasking of rank in a room that had spent weeks underestimating a man precisely because he had allowed it to. Marisol, still standing beside him in the unfinished pattern of their dance, felt the eyes of the entire assembly shift toward her as well, understanding with sudden and dizzying clarity exactly how much had just changed, and exactly how publicly it had changed. Lord Brassington crossed the room within seconds, his expression cycling rapidly through shock, calculation, and an entirely unconvincing attempt at having somehow known all along, offering effusive welcomes and apologies for the modest accommodations a duke had been given without complaint for the better part of 3 weeks. Verity, paler than her careful rouge could disguise, abandoned every prior strategy in favor of immediate and visible warmth, complimenting Hallam's discretion as though it had been a delightful game, rather than a deliberate test of her family's character. She attempted, with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent years adjusting her approach to suit-shifting circumstances, to recapture the ground she believed she had merely misplaced rather than genuinely lost, reminding him of their earlier conversations, their shared laughter at the pianoforte, the music she had arranged specifically with his comfort in mind. Hallam received her renewed attention with the same polite distance he had maintained throughout his stay, neither cruel in his correction, nor inclined to pretend the past 3 weeks had not revealed exactly what they had revealed. Marisol said nothing throughout the scramble around her, watching her family's sudden and transparent reorientation with an expression that mixed quiet astonishment with something more painful underneath it. The recognition that her family's warmth, when finally offered toward the stranger among them, had only ever been a function of his rank, never once extended with such enthusiasm toward her own quieter, steadier presence, not in this room, and not in the 17 years before it. Hallam allowed the room's excitement to settle for a moment before he spoke again. And when he did, he addressed not Lord Brassington nor Verity, but turned instead, deliberately and without hesitation, toward Marisol, extending his hand once more in a gesture the entire assembly understood instantly as something far beyond the courtesy of finishing an interrupted dance. "I came to this house to learn what kind of family it truly was," he said, his voice pitched to carry clearly across the now silent room, "and I confess I expected to find very little worth admiring. I did not expect to overhear, in a corridor I should not have lingered in, the only honest sentence spoken in this house since my arrival. He paused, watching understanding dawn slowly across her face as she realized precisely which conversation he meant. You said you cared only whether a man was kind when no one was watching him be kind. I have spent every day since trying to be worthy of being judged by exactly that measure, and not by the title I withheld from you. The room remained utterly silent, the kind of silence that follows a sentence too significant to interrupt with idle comment. And Marisol, her composure finally and visibly breaking into something raw and unguarded, allowed her hand to remain in his, understanding that whatever came next would not be built on rank or rumor or the careful architecture her sister had spent weeks constructing, but on the one truth she had spoken without ever intending an audience at all. The county talked of little else for weeks afterward. The story of the disguised duke and the overlooked daughter passing from drawing room to drawing room with the particular relish reserved for tales that confirmed, however rarely, that virtue might occasionally receive its due in a world generally arranged to reward the louder voice in the room. Verity's strategies, so carefully constructed, dissolved into nothing more than the cautionary footnote of a story that had, in the end, never truly been about her. Hallam courted Marisol with the same deliberate patience he had shown from their very first quiet morning in the garden, never rushing the trust he had spent 3 weeks of disguise earning the hard way, allowing her family's belated affections to remain exactly what they were. Too late to matter, too transparent to forgive easily, though not so late as to prevent a quieter, steadier happiness from finally finding the daughter who had waited the longest for it. What the household eventually understood, though only Marisol had ever truly lived it, was that titles revealed nothing reliable about the character standing beneath them, and that the truest measure of any person remained exactly what she had said in that unguarded corridor, not what a person possessed or claimed or performed for an audience, but what they chose to be when they believed, with complete and unguarded certainty, that absolutely no one of consequence was watching them at all. Years later, she could still be found near the same window where she had once stood unnamed and unnoticed, a skein of gray wool resting in her lap as she worked it slowly into something new. Except now, when she looked up, it was to find Hallam watching her with the same quiet attention he had given her from the very first evening, no longer a stranger cataloging a household's secrets, but a husband who had learned, long ago, exactly what was worth seeing. If you believe kindness should be the only title that ever truly matters, tell us in the comments. And if this story moved you, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. There's always another house, another secret, and another woman waiting to finally be seen,